Welcome back to episode 84 of the Potter Discussion. I'm your host Oscar, and on today's episode, we will be discussing the evolution of Dumbledore, Richard Harris, and Michael Gambon. Let's get into this. Welcome back. Today, we're talking about Dumbledore and the switch between the actor of Richard Harris and Michael Gambon. With the unfortunate death of Richard Harris after the filming of the second movie, Michael Gambon took over in The Prisoner of Azkaban to act as Dumbledore. And as always, before we get into this episode, I will remind you that the links to send any topic ideas, questions, even Quizmaster questions to the show, well, those links are still open in the show notes. You can send in a voice submission, a text submission, and really anything you want to say. Just go down and use those. It's completely free, and it'll only take 1 or 2 minutes of your time. That'd be greatly appreciated. So let's just get into this. I want to start off by saying both Dumbledores did a fantastic job, and they both really brought out the really great aspects of the character of Dumbledore. I just want to clear that up. We will be really picking them apart today, so I just want to get it out of the way that both of them really did a great job. But let's just start with a quick timeline. We did go over this in the beginning, but a more accurate one would be helpful. So, in the first filming of the first movie, Richard Harris played as Dumbledore. He was the actor and did a fantastic job. He was really nice and kind as a character, and that also carried over into the second movie that he also acted in. Unfortunately, he died before they could film the third movie, but Michael Gambon took over and did another fantastic job with that movie, and they kept Gambon because of his performance. So let's just dive into this and start off with, really talking about these characters and what they did well. So Harris's version was more friendly and cheerful, while Gambon was much more intense and thoughtful. I think that's a great place to start, and that's really the biggest contrast, I feel like. That's really where a lot of people differentiate between these two people. So Harris was the more gentler side of Dumbledore. I feel like he was, kind. He was more kind. That's a good way to put it. He was, friendly and always light and cheerful and stuff. But Gambon was kind of the opposite. He was really, the more intense side, but he was, I know they're pretty much the same person, but I feel like Gambon would, do better in, say, like a fight, or he could, strategize better. He can make the hard decisions easier than Harris's version. I think that's mostly because Harris is more kind, and he's more of a, happy, skipping through the meadow kind of person, whereas Gambon's Dumbledore was much more, almost dark. Gambon's Dumbledore was very thoughtful and really thinking in a, kind of worst case scenario mindset, whereas Harris was really thinking in like a, this is going to turn out for the best, so let's just prepare for that. And that really contrasted with their characters, and the switch between Dumbledores wasn't as smooth as I feel like it could have been. If the direction was, okay, Harris, be kind and thoughtful, yes, but also show that more intense side, especially in the second movie, when Harry and Ron got in trouble, he was like an excited parent showing their kids a present, or like revealing a trip, like, you broke so many rules, but I'm going to give you a trophy because you did a good job. There's almost no reprimanding. He only did that for maybe a couple seconds or so. Most of that scene was just spent on Harris saying, good job, you did a fantastic job. So I feel like that was one of the last scenes we had with Harris. So if he had done something more along the lines of you did, some very serious things and really gave them a talking to, I feel like then when Gambon took over in the third movie, it would have been like, yes, this is the character, but he just has to be more serious because of the situation. I feel like we could have been thinking along the same line and saw that change as the movies continued much easier if there was more of a darker side revealed in the third movie by Harris. And I think that's, one of the things I could have worked on, just having that, slope not be, a cliff, but more of a hill. And even in the first movie, if Harris had done something like what he was supposed to do in the second movie, I feel like that transition even between Harris's two versions of the character would have been even more helpful in that switch between Gambon and Harris, or rather, Harris to Gambon. But unfortunately, I don't think they could have foreseen that because Harris's death was rather sudden, so they couldn't prepare for something like that, or exactly what happened. So that might have also been a factor that they didn't expect the character change, and they couldn't direct the, Harris to be like Gambon. So that was another tough situation. But even it's like these two Dumbledores are the two character sides. If we had a character that was the exact middle of Harris and Gambon, I feel like that could have been so much better. I did really like Gambon, I did really like Harris, but if we could have a middle ground, that would have been perfect. I don't think we've ever had a scene where Gambon was really nice. He was really kind to a person, and we have almost never had something where he was really doing something that wasn't to defeat Voldemort. And he was, kind of like a grandfather, like making jokes and stuff like that, but he wasn't really a people person. He was a strategy person. And that really fed into the whole dark and thoughtful aspect of Dumbledore that Gambon chose to portray. So even J.K. Rowling herself said Michael Gambon was very intense and much more dark than I ever expected. That's what she said. But I haven't come across an interview with J.K. Rowling where she said something about Harris, but I can imagine that she could have said that Harris was too light and too personable and not, Dumbledore-ish enough, whereas Gambon was Dumbledore over the top, but Harris was really low-key and kind of like the cool teacher, So, let's move on. So on the subject of Dumbledore, as this episode just so happens to be about, let's dive into Harris's character a bit more deeply. So if we really analyze his character, we can see that he is very different from the books. And I don't mean that in the way that he couldn't have acted in the later movies. I just mean that the Harry Potter story got very dark after the first few books, after the first few movies. And I don't think Harris could have portrayed that darkness enough. I don't think he could have been, the dark and Dumbledore that is killed. I don't think Harris it wasn't designed to be someone who couldn't, be intense and be even mean. So Harris was really the nice Dumbledore. It's like the angel and devil on your shoulder. The angel would be Harris. And it seems like he couldn't act in the later films, like we were just talking about. He couldn't be that dark of a person. I'm thinking about the cave scene. I don't think Harris could have been, seeing those horrible things and being attacked by the Inferi and casting those horrible spells. I don't think Harris could have lived up to what Gambon did, and I don't think Gambon could have lived up to what Harris did. They really worked with each other's strengths. Gambon was really good at portraying an intense and really deep character, someone who had a lot of layers and was like an onion, and who was someone you couldn't look at and figure out. And I think Harris was so much the opposite of that. It was really a good thing to see that he was just like you. He was very personable and relatable and kind. And that's just something that you can't get if he were to be in those darker scenes. That's something that Harris couldn't have ever dreamed of. To be a dark character, to be mean, to have that side of you that is always thinking and always calculating and always making the hard decisions to really get you towards that goal. I think Gambon was only strategical. He was only logical. He was always thinking about Dumbledore. Or Voldemort. And he was always making the right decision, but that decision was always the wrong one, because if you want to be 100% strategical, you can never make the right decision, and that's unfortunate. From a moral and ethical standpoint, being strategical is horrible. You can't be a good person and still make strategic decisions. You can't be logical without being harsh and offensive, and something that you can never achieve is strategical prowess in being nice. You can't make the easy decisions and still have a good path. Dumbledore said himself, you always have the choice between doing what is right and what is easy, and you always have to choose right. And that is exactly what Dumbledore did. He lived by that. That is something that he was constantly practicing, almost like a religion. He was always, going off of I'm always going to have to do something that is right and not the thing that is easy. You can always do something that you know that yourself is something that is unhealthy for you, but you still do it because it's easy. But Dumbledore is so much the opposite of that. Gambon made those decisions that were so difficult that they were the opposite of the easy decision. They were so, almost cold. They were so coldly right that the ethics and morality were just thrown out the window. So, bottom line, Gambon really did a fantastic job portraying that calculating and really, I'm not going to say non-ethical, but calculating and sacrificing Dumbledore. The one who would willingly do something like, kill Harry. That's something that Dumbledore purposely happened, and it pained him. It did pain him. He was an emotional person, and he had feelings, and he was, he was a real emotional guy, but he still recognized the utter importance of defeating Voldemort. I would say defeat Dumbledore, but it's like the same person, of defeating Voldemort, and really getting to the point where Harry was the winner, and Harry came out on top, and that was just something that is so difficult to achieve, because Voldemort has such an annoying knack of just getting so much power. Never defeat him, but the way Gambon gathered his pieces and really set them up in such a way that he really just let them all fall. Putting something in the sky and dropping it and having it fall years later in the exact position he wanted to. So that's something that Gambon was really, really good at, making sure that everything happened exactly the way it did. Whereas Harris was a bit of a different story. If Gambon was like an onion, then Harris is like a carrot. And I think Harris was such a compelling character and such a really riveting person to watch because he is so obviously and blatantly one-sided. And I don't mean that in he isn't a, dimensional person, but he just really doesn't have the, multiple personality. I think Gambon really has those two sides to him of thinking and being ethical. And he can never ever operate on both. And that's why, defeating Voldemort is such a difficult thing, because Voldemort only has the logical part of it, but Gambon has to work on just using his logical brain when he is trying to defeat Voldemort and not using his moral one. But I think I'm going very off topic here, but I think that's also why he managed to defeat Voldemort, because he could use both his moral and logical brains at the same time. That's when he learned to not only be able to calculate and make those hard decisions, but do it in a way that really helps everyone. And I think that's especially prominent when he had to tell Harry that he had to die. It's such a difficult decision to send someone like Harry away, someone you've almost had like a son, away to die. That's something that is so hard. And I think he overcame his moral dilemmas and understood. His logical and ethical brains worked together to make that decision. He knew that Harry would come back, but still sending him away was very difficult. That was such a strategic move, however, that it really offset the balance of that's a bad decision into that's a good decision. Of course, Harry did come back, and Dumbledore did know that he would. It's just a very, very difficult thing to decide and really understand that that's something that has to happen. So, just a good job for Gambon. He managed to make that decision, and I am referring to the two Dumbledores as Harris and Gambon. Just, I'm not going to say Dumbledore 1 and Dumbledore 2. So, Harris and Gambon, those are two ones. But Harris, as I said before, very one-sided, and that's a good thing. I think Harry at a young stage really couldn't understand and really accept that he had to do some of the hardest things ever, and even throughout the whole school, all the students put together might not have to face the horrors that he did, of course, besides the Battle of Hogwarts and stuff. But Harris really was a perfect person for Harry to have in his life when he was young, really facing all this Harry Potter stuff for the first time. Harris was someone you could relate to. You could see him and know immediately. You could understand who he was and know how you could help yourself and be nice with Harris right when you saw him. That's something that I feel like Harris really excelled at, just being a nice and relatable and personable person. He was approachable and someone you didn't have to, go over in your head what you were going to say. Like, if you're ordering for the first time as a kid, you're like making a script for yourself in your head. But if you know the person behind the counter, it just becomes easy like that, a snap, and you're good. And that's exactly what Harris was like. Harris was the nice person behind that counter. He was the nice person that would ask you in a polite way and a way that you could respond with ease, and you knew exactly what you were going to get the whole time, so why were you even freaking out? Harris is that kind of person. He's the nice one. He's the person behind the counter who knows exactly what you're going to get and does it in a way that allows you to not freak out over what you're going to say. It's a strange analogy, but I think it's a fitting one for this situation. So I think for this segment, we can just pretty much gather that Harris is very approachable and someone like a school counselor. That's the school counselor. But Gambon is, the football coach, really intense and not really thinking about ethics, but just wants to win the whole time. So those are the two sides. Yeah. And coming off that note of Harris, we're going into Gambon. We're diving deep into his character. So, I think this is a pretty bold statement, but I think Gambon was a little too intense. And I know I just said that his, logical and ethical brain worked together, but I still think that he had some work to do in the friendliness and personable department. If Harris is the one you can approach behind the counter and know exactly what you're going to order, Gambon is the one that has had a really bad day and just goes, "Come on, what do you want? So I'm speaking from the heart here. It's like my worst fear, going up and not knowing what I want to order and then having to like think on the spot, and they're like annoyed with me. Oh my gosh. Well, now you know something about me. But that's completely unrelated. Okay, so for Gambon to have that intensity to him, I feel like it really carries over and helps. It really helps in the later story because he has to have that intensity. He has to have that mental, he is so unblocked in his mental state. I think that really helps him with his decision making, with his ethical decision making, and every other decision making he has ever made. So Gambon's intensity, I think, comes from the fact that Dumbledore in the later books is really going through a lot. And we discover so much about Dumbledore, it almost is like he becomes a different character, and Gambon took that literally. In the third book, that didn't carry over as much, because on that hill we aren't fully down. So he is still, very much like Harris, in that he isn't, the mean and dark and just raw. I think he's brutally honest. I wouldn't say mean, but brutally honest. He makes the decisions that no one wants to and puts the things into action that are so difficult too. That was very grammatically correct, so yeah. But I feel like Gambon doesn't really have the niceness and the approachability that Harris does, and that's a really difficult part of this, because if Gambon doesn't have that I'm a nice person and you can always talk to me anytime you want, Harry had to keep a lot of his feelings inside, and Dumbledore only wanted to know about his scar hurting and his visions and his things that would help defeat Voldemort. But what Gambon didn't want to know was all of his personal traumas, with Ron, with dealing with his friends, with trying to, doing these things all by himself. Gambon really didn't do anything in the department of being a good person. He didn't focus on the fact that Harry was struggling through being, friends with Ron. Ron had to run away because the Horcrux was just getting too much. His hunting was horrible. So Dumbledore didn't recognize that not everyone had his mindset. Not everyone could just shut off their morality and continue on through life making the perfect decisions. And especially with a group of people like Ron, Hermione, and Harry, that's just something that you can't get. With a group of people, you can't work together harmoniously with just ethical and logical brains. You have to use every aspect of what you have. So, I said ethical and logical. I meant just logical. You can't go through a situation with just a logical part of your brain working, because you can't work with other people like that. It's like trying to play baseball by just using math. You can't do that. You have to know how to swing the bat, and you have to know how to throw the ball. You can calculate how to catch, you can calculate how to throw, but that'll never change with your muscle memory, really practicing and getting the motion down. It's anything like that, even living, and this directly translates. You can't go over into life and start living through a practical and ethical and logical view on how you do things. You have to have that emotion. You have to feel your decisions. You can't think them. You have to feel and think what you're doing in order for them to be the right decision. You have to know exactly what you're going to do before you do it, not just in your brain, but also in your heart. And that's exactly what Dumbledore expected Harry, Ron, and Hermione to do. He expected them to shut off their humanity almost and, become these robots of just calculation, which I don't think they could have done. I don't think Harry would do that. I don't think Hermione could. Hermione, I feel like, is another interesting situation because it's almost like she relies on her logical brain to, do stuff, to get through things. That's her strength. She is really smart and good at magic. And her emotion brain, her ethical brain, that's something that I feel like is very, very vital. She would be exactly like Dumbledore if she didn't use her ethical brain. And that's a good thing, but also a bad thing, because one, Dumbledore, I feel like, is enough. Gambon really used his ethical brain to do things not just in the, I'm going to make this decision and I'm going to do it right category, but he also used his ethical brain to, feel with Ariana and his brother and the pain of what his life was. So he had to stop feeling and only use his logical brain because the feeling was too much. His decisions were so big and so complex. I don't think Gambon could have ever operated on both brains for very long, and that's exactly what happened. He started using both brains, and that was something that was so difficult. But you have to take the right route. You always have the choice to do what's right and what is easy, and Gambon chose what was right. He used both of his brains, and he used both of his skill sets to overcome the challenge of defeating the forces of evil. And in order to do that, he had to feel his decisions in his heart and think his decisions in his brain. So in order to overcome what he did, his sacrifice of life was the necessary cost of using every aspect of his ability in order to defeat an impossible opponent. He had to use some of the most difficult skills he had maintained throughout his very large sum of years, congratulations, by the way. And he just had like this almost drive of not, I'm going to do this because I want to. I'm going to do this because I have to. And that's why it worked. He made the sacrifice of life so he could use both of his brains for the vital amount of time. He knew that Dumbledore himself, Gambon, had to die, just like Harry, but there had to be a balance. They couldn't both die and both come back to life. Harry had to die and come back to life, and Gambon couldn't. So Gambon knew that he had to use his time wisely, and he had to maximize his time by using both of his brains. He had to think in an ethical standpoint and in a logical standpoint. He had to use both of the brains he had in order to make the absolute right decisions. Before that, he was making the right decisions just by his logical brain, and those were the logically correct decisions. By far, those would get him much, much farther than using both brains. But he couldn't use just the logical brain because that isn't how it works. If he is using fighting fire with fire, Voldemort and Dumbledore, that would never work. Because if I do say so myself, Voldemort is the better logic user. And that was not a mishap. Yes, Voldemort, the evil one, I feel like was better at figuring out those logical situations. But that was just because he has never used his morality, and he will never. But Dumbledore did. So it's like being able to throw, a football 100 miles an hour, but only doing it 50. But you can do that consistently, but you never reach your max speed. Dumbledore had to use his max speed, but he threw his arm out, and that was a necessary sacrifice. Gambon, that's his name, Gambon had to think both sides of the story and make sure that every decision he made sense on both fronts in order to almost attack Voldemort in his morality. in the book, Harry and Dumbledore and Voldemort go at a morality duel before they even start their final battle. Harry knows exactly what will pull at Voldemort's heartstrings and force him to activate both sides of his brain. And that logical brain will never be able to keep up with his moral one because he has too much feeling. These people like Voldemort and Gambon, Dumbledore and Harris, they all have too much emotion to feel it all at once. So they have to think in a logical standpoint. Voldemort is ashamed of his parents. He grew up in an orphanage all his life. Then he was killing so many people and gaining so much power, becoming something that even wasn't himself. Dumbledore's entire family died except for Aberforth, and he was forced to raise a pig for slaughter, Harry. Of course, he knew that Harry would come back to life, but it's still a really hard thing to do. Harris was dealing with the Sorcerer's Stone, the Chamber of Secrets. Students were getting petrified left and right. It was luck that was keeping his students alive. He was having to close Hogwarts. And all of these things just can't keep up with each other. You can't feel too much or you will explode. Like, I think in this situation, Ron is right. One person can't feel that much because they've exploded. And I feel like if one person had felt as much as Dumbledore, as Gambon, or as Harris, or even as Voldemort, I feel like they could never have lived a normal life. Their existence wouldn't be as it is if they had that much going on in them. That's just something that the normal human can't contain. So these four people, I am seeing Harris, Gambon, and Dumbledore as three different people, and Voldemort, they couldn't operate on the morality and ethical side of their life. If they did, they would never survive. That's something that I don't think they could ever have done, and they didn't. I think that was a great decision for them to only go off of logical, and it wasn't a fantastic decision for Gambon to make that switch in the end. And he had to take on all of his emotion and use what he had left, the time he had left, more years than decades. He had to think of what he wanted to do and execute it as fast as he could, because his ethical would catch up with his logical brain faster than he could run from it. You can't outrun someone that's faster than you, and his moral brain was by far faster than him. So he was trying to outrun a horse. You can't run faster than something that can run faster than you. So if Gambon tried to outrun his moral brain before his logical one could take over, I feel like he would not have done exactly what he did. But he managed to use his moral brain in a way that gave him a head start, and he could make it to the finish line just before his moral brain did, in order to set the pieces in motion for his death, for Harry's death, for Harry's survival, and for the victory of the forces of good over the forces of evil. Wow, that was one talking point. I have maybe 15 more to go, but this has been a very long episode. Thank you for sticking with me the whole way if you're hearing this message. Again, the links in the show notes below are still open. Any topics, any long rants you want to have played on the show, anything that you want me to hear, just go use those things down in the description. It's completely free, it's fast, it's easy. Just go do that and your life will be so amazing. That's not a promise, but you can believe it. If you have any questions, comments, or topics that you would like to hear on the podcast, definitely send me an email. My email is thepotterdiscussion@gmail.com. That is thepotterdiscussion@gmail.com. Links in the description. I'm saying it again so it's ingrained in your brain. Use those in the description below. The links. Okay, it's ingrained in your brain enough. If you could just scroll down in your podcast app of choice, tap those 5 stars, or even leave a written review, that could help me out more than you could ever know, and it helps other listeners find the show. As always, use this information to your advantage, and I will see you later.